Ah, yes. Aphrodite Negra. Aphrodite Negra. Can you see that? Aphrodite Negra means black Aphrodite. And this is not a great film. I'm just doing a very quick review of this film just because some of you people that are into obscure films, hopefully some people that like obscure films like me will eventually watch some of these videos. Some of you people who are into obscure films may collect black exploitation films, or it's sometimes called black sexploitation films, spelled B-L-A-X, films. By the way, exploitation does not mean that the black people in the films were exploited. Just like sexploitation doesn't mean that the women who perform in the films are exploited. Neither of those terms mean that. Now, those people may or may not have been exploited, but that's not what the term means. In movie parlance, an exploitation film is a film that exploits a certain faction in an audience. So a sexploitation film is a film that exploits the fact that there's an audience for naked women. Okay, a black exploitation film or blaxploitation exploits the fact that there's an audience for an all-black film. It's set in a film set in the black community. And black sexploitation, a lot of people don't understand that in the early days of film, after the silent era was over, in the 20s and 30s, there was this black cinema which rose up out of nowhere, and black people had their own movie theaters and they had their own movies that were all black mostly. And people like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway and Lena Horne, and Mantan Moreland, and people like that were big stars in the black cinema. And those films served a purpose because the mainstream studios really didn't make films that revolved around black characters. So black people could go to the black theater, watch the black films, and see films about black people. And that served a purpose for a long time. But as the cinema became more and more integrated and movie making became more and more expensive as time wore on, and for various economic and reasons, that I really don't want to go into a long thing about the history of black cinema, but all black films died out basically, and I couldn't actually put a date to that off the top of my head, but let's just say by the 50s most of those black cinemas were closed and there were a lot fewer of these black films being made. So we enter the period of the 1960s, and there are very few films being made set in the black community, very few films. There are films about racial issues, mostly starring Sidney Poitier, who is considered the go-to guy for racial issues. And so they made these films about racial issues, but it was usually Sidney Poitier surrounded by a sea of white people in most of these films that he made, which doesn't mean they're bad films. But they weren't. But these were films about race issues that were designed primarily to sell tickets to white people. And if a few black people came too, that was fine. But they weren't films designed to be popular in the black community. They were films designed for the mass audience. So by the 1970s, the black community had been without, their own films for a long time. There really weren't films coming out. And with the rise of drive-ins in the 50s, there was a whole new market for low-budget films. It became more economically viable to produce low-budget films. That's as American International and some of the other countries sprang up in the 50s and began mass marketing lots of low-budget films, primarily because the drive-in market existed and gave them enough of a cushion that they could afford to make films. If they had to book all their films into regular indoor theaters and compete with the big boys, it would have been very hard for these companies to start up. But drive-ins enabled that. It was a new market for films, and there was a new market for dubbed foreign films and low-budget films. And in the 1970s, a pioneering producer named Melvin Van Peebles, who's the father of Mario Van Peebles, produced a famous black exploitation film called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, which was an infamous film because they tried to give it an X rating for the simple reason that the word mother effer, the actual swear, was in the film once. They tried to give it an X rating because that was considered unacceptable. And Melvin Van Peebles had to fight them, and there's a terrific movie that his son made about his dad's efforts to produce this film, and I can't remember what it's called, but you can look it up. And tells the whole story better than I can. But the film was ultimately a success. It was made on a shoestring budget, and it made a ton of money in the black community primarily, which led to this whole explosion in black films. And in the 1970s, movies like Shaft and Superfly and Hammer and Coffee and Truck Turner, all these films were made on very low budgets, and they did very decent money generally, so a lot of them were made. And I'm a particular fan of Pam Grier. I think I have all of her movies from the 70s, all of her American International movies, and a few of her movies from beyond too. I have all of her starring vehicles, and Pam Grier is great. And if you want to watch her best movie, watch Coffee, which is my favorite, Coffy. But the only reason I'm doing this tape was not to give a history lesson on black cinema. Maybe I will. I will definitely do a video someday on Pam Grier. But this movie, this packaging, if you ever see this, is designed to look like a Pam Grier movie. In fact, in the movie Coffee, Pam Grier, in the climax, is wielding a shotgun, which is, I'm sure, is not a coincidence when they were planning this movie. This poster is very much trying to create the feeling that this is a Pam Grier movie. It's not. And this is not a black exploitation movie. It looks like one, doesn't it? It definitely looks like one. This is a sex exploitation movie. In other words, this is a nudie movie. They make it look like a black movie. It's not a black movie. It's a nudie movie. So the main purpose of this video is to warn you that if you collect black exploitation films, you can skip a film, an Italian film, called Black Aphrodite, because it's really a rather poorly made sex exploitation film that has lots of pretty hardcore, for a not X-rated film, it's pretty hardcore fake sex scenes and lots of nudity and not much else. The plot is poor, it's not compelling. If you're not actually masturbating while watching it, you're going to be bored like I was bored. I wasn't masturbating, so you're going to be bored watching this, so I don't recommend it. Interesting thing, though, about this film is Ajita Wilson, the black woman who is the lead in this film, actually came from the world of porn. And because this film has a lot of a lot of nudity and a lot of faked sex scenes, but they're faked, but the director seems to want to push the limits of what he can show in a fake sex scene. And the women who are doing the scenes are felt up quite extensively, and the sex is faked pretty darn realistically compared to what fake sex scenes in R-rated movies usually look like. So there's a lot of that. So I think it's kind of interesting that this Ajita Wilson, who is only listed as Ajita in the credits of this film, was not a famous, but was a porno actress, and then she made this film, and apparently made one or two other like non-porno films. So she's promoted as a star in this film. One big thing that's wrong with this film, and I have to say, Ajita Wilson tastes differ. What is a beautiful woman? We can't agree on that. There's no agreeable standard. Society has a standard. I happen to think that Kitten Natividad, who was the Russ Meyer star, is gorgeous. My good friend Bill thinks that Kitten Natividad is homely. These things are a matter of personal taste. Ajita Wilson is certainly pretty, very pretty, and she has a nice figure. So I'm not saying she's homely, but she's a rather odd-looking woman. She has very high cheekbones, very prominent cheekbones, and a very heart-shaped face that comes down to a round chin. And her face in this movie, I mean, it's pretty, but she looks somewhat odd. It's the sort of beauty that we won't all agree on. Some people will think she's gorgeous, some people will think she's just average, and some people like me will think she's rather pretty. So I just wanted to mention that. She's a rather odd-looking person, but a rather exotic-looking, I should say, is a better word than odd. And it's a sort of an exoticism that not everybody likes. So she's just one of those people that's it's going to be totally subjective, up to you as to whether you're attracted to her or not. I think she's pretty. The other thing I wanted to say about this film, though, was that the thing that really ruins it from even a sexploitation angle, because this film has lots of nudity, but it isn't particularly sexy. The thing that really ruins this film more than anything else is the direction. This film is amateur hour. It's very poorly shot. a lot of the indoor scenes, they didn't seem to have brought any lights at all. They seemed to just be shooting with the the regular indoor electric lamps and lights. And this means a lot of the scenes, including a lot of these sex scenes, there's way too much shadow on the people, and especially when you have the black skin or the brown skin, which is darker, it doesn't reflect light the same as the white skin, doesn't show the same kind of contrast, which is just a scientific fact. When that shadow falls on it, it becomes much harder to distinguish Ajita's features and everything. So it's not properly lit in a lot of scenes. The director has some weird idea of what the director's job is. In some scenes he seems to be trying to do as many jump cuts as possible. He's got a scene in a bowling alley where they start with a close-up of the ball coming out of the chute, and then the hand comes down to get the ball, then it's a cut to the guy talking to the other guy, it's another cut, they're talking from another angle, then it's a cut to him throwing the ball, and they literally cut to a camera behind the pins, showing the pins getting knocked down, then they cut back to the two guys talking, and it's like this short scene of like a minute and a half scene of two guys talking in a bowling alley while they bowl, and there's like 25 cuts in there. It's insane what this director's doing. And in fact, he seems to like the worm's eye view, which is a very strange choice of a shot to overuse, but he uses the worm's eye view a lot. And even in some of the sex scenes where the women are disrobing, he will plant the camera in the worst possible spot that I can think of, on the side of the woman about midway down the thigh, looking up, which exaggerates the hip, exaggerates the thigh, doesn't really show any of the naughty bits, and makes the woman look like some sort of weird, freakish giant. And he does this weird camera angle on nude or semi-nude women like 3 times in the movie, which is 3 times too often. And a lot of his camera angles are weird, and just, it's basically a director that doesn't know what he's doing, or just doesn't care, or maybe he's drunk. I don't know what the reason is, but the direction, the lighting, the cinematography, all of that is piss poor in this movie. So that's another reason to avoid it. The only reason to get Black Aphrodite, or Aphrodite Nigra, which is the original name, the only reason to get this film is that if you collect Italian sexploitation films, or if you have a collection of Ajita Wilson films. If you don't, or if you're just such a hardcore collector of sexploitation films that you have to have them all. Other than that, if you don't fit into one of those categories, do not get this film and do not watch this film. And don't be fooled by this poster, which makes it look like a Pam Grier film. That's why I took this film, because I thought, oh, here's a black exploitation film, and I like black exploitation films. And it looks like a Pam Grier film. That's for me. That's what I thought. I was fooled. Don't you be fooled. So Ajita Wilson, sorry, wish I could have given you, you're probably passed away by now, but wish I could have given you a better review than that, but it's not a good film. So, Black Aphrodite, not a good film and not a black exploitation film. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.